Earlier this year, our son Ben and our daughter-in-law, Audrey, bought our house in San Antonio. We sold it to them as we were moving to our river property. And you know how houses are. There's always a lot of good things about them, but there's always stuff you don't like. And one of the things I didn't like about the house, and Ben doesn't like, is the designer just never quite got enough cold air blowing into the master bedroom, right? And it's like, if there's any room, take it out of the kids' room, but don't take it out of mom and dad's room, right? And so Ben decided to put a Mitsubishi unit in there on the wall to, just cool that thing down. So I was texting him the other day saying, hey, how'd it go? And he goes, oh, it's phenomenal. I just love it. And it reminded me that I think electricity may be the greatest scientific invention ever. Linda and I lived a lot of our years in East Africa without electricity, and we really came to fully appreciate it when we were living in Nairobi in 2005. That year, because of drought, Kenya was rationing electricity, especially in the capital city, and so we would get it 10 hours on, 14 hours off, and they changed it all the time. You never knew if we were going to get it at nighttime or daytime. But we far preferred having electricity at night because, like Ben, we just slept a lot better if we had a fan blowing on us. Well, one night, we didn't have electricity, and I was laying there in bed, doing my best not to move, because every time you move, you create more body heat, right? And so I'm trying not to move, and I'm over here on my left side, and all of a sudden, I feel something bite me right here in the ribs. And it's completely dark. I mean, there's zero electricity. And you know how it is when you get surprised by something like that. You just sort of naturally kind of swat at it, right, with your elbow. So I don't know what's biting me there, but I want that thing off of me. Well, unfortunately, it was Linda who bit me. Kind of a love bite, I guess. I mean, And so I did that. Well, when I did it, I hit her right here in the nose and the eye. And oh man, she's tough as nails. She was crying. She was hurting so badly. And we can laugh at it now, but we came to the conclusion that life was better and we were happier when the electricity was on. Most of us are happier when the electricity's on, aren't we? I mean, just think about it. When your spouse is treating you the way you think they ought to be treating you, the electricity is on, and life is better that way. It's happier. Whenever your kids are doing well, and by that we mean, the kids are kind of living up to the way I think they ought to be doing. Whether they're this tall or this tall, they're doing what I think. The electricity is on. Or when your finances are in the black and you're not stressed over anything, man, the electricity is on. When you love your job, when your health is good, when your life is just generally up and to the right, the electricity is on, and it's true, isn't it? Life is just better when it's on. I get it. But of course, that means that your happiness is only as reliable as the power grid of life. And by now that you and I don't control that. And if that's concerning to you, you might want to ask yourself if there is a more reliable source of genuine happiness. And since we're studying the book of James, and since the subject of James is trials, you might want to ask yourself if that kind of happiness is even connected to the subject of trials. I mean, when the electricity is off, trials are on, right? And because it seems like trials, really, and happiness, it just seems like they don't even belong in the same sentence with each other. However, James used them in the same sentence. And as we pick up with verse 12 in our study this morning, he used it in this sentence. Look at what he said. He said, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. For when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him." James 1:12 contains the key to genuine happiness, the very thing that I know all of us want. And it shows us the third of three values that actually accrue from trials in our lives. We saw in week 1 that trials produce endurance. In week 2, we saw that they produce wisdom. And today we're going to see that trials, when you and I face them well, actually produce genuine happiness in our lives. But how does it work? Because most of us don't equate happiness with the electricity being off. Well, James began verse 12 with the word blessed. This word means to be especially favored, fortunate, or privileged, and as a result, to be happy. You might recognize it as the same word that Jesus used 9 times in a row in Matthew chapter 5 in the Beatitudes. There, Jesus told us who we could expect to be genuinely happy. But his list sounded nothing like what we might have expected. Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, those who mourn, the meek, those who are hunger and thirst after righteousness, the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers, the persecuted, those who are mocked for following Christ." Clearly, in Jesus' mind, happiness had very little to do with the electricity being on. Trials feel very much like the electricity being off, don't they? Trials often take us through very dark periods in our lives. But James said it's the electricity being off that reminds us how fortunate and how privileged we are when we endure until it comes back on. That's what happiness is, isn't it? It's the wisdom to understand just how fortunate you are to have actually come through and be on the other side of the trial. But of course, that only happens if you and I endure. James said, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial." Now, to remain steadfast under trial translates this one single Greek word. It's the Greek word hupomeno, and we only mention it because it's a compound word. We encountered the noun form of it in week 1 of our series. James uses the same word here now. Hupo means under, ameno means to abide or to remain. And so we use the example of Mr. Atlas, right? Who has the weight of the world on his shoulders. And to endure means that you remain under this burden. And that's what trials often feel like. I mean, that's what the electricity being off feels like. You're sweating. Everything you do, nothing's the same. You can't see anything. Life doesn't work the way we're used to it working. And of course, to endure is to remain under this thing. But always there's the possibility that we won't endure. And when we don't endure, we let it roll off so that we can simply quit and walk away. To endure is the key then to genuine happiness. And James said there was a reason that endurance produces happiness. Look what he said in the verse. He said, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him." The phrase, "when he has stood the test," means to be approved. The word approved is actually used in this verse, even though the ESV doesn't translate it that way. And it means to be found genuine based on having passed a test. And James said that whenever you and I are approved, we receive the crown of life. So the word, there are 2 words in the Greek language for crown. One of them was diadema, and this referred to a crown of royalty. So only certain people got that crown. But then there's also the word that James used here. It's the word Stephanos. If your name is Stephen, you've been named after that. And this was a crown that was given or awarded as a prize for exceptional service or conduct. It was that garland of green foliage that was placed on the brow. It was often given to Olympic runners or conquering generals. And James used it here for those who have competed in the games of life and have endured. Y'all, James said, when we endure, we are approved. And when approved, we receive the crown of life. Well, what is that crown of life? The crown of life refers to a quality and depth of life that comes from having endured the trial itself. It's automatic. When you and I endure through trials, we are approved and we receive the crown of life. There is a depth and a quality to life that could not have been known any other way. And so the crown of life is actually the genuine happiness. It's the state of being blessed that James began with, and it accrues to us based on our understanding of just how fortunate and privileged we are to have come through the trial. And this crown, James said, this genuine happiness can only be awarded to those who endure. You know, decades ago, before we went overseas, and we still had television and stuff like that, Linda and I did. It's a weird story, but anyway, I caught a bit of the Ironman triathlon in Hawaii. This was decades ago. And the cameras, of course, were set up on the finish line. They wanted to see everybody who came through and kind of what they looked like and at the end of the race. And at one point, the cameras were focused on a guy who was coming in, and as they followed him, the commentators were simply ecstatic talking about this guy's performance. But it wasn't because he was winning. In fact, this guy finished hours behind the winners. Their excitement was over the fact that he was finishing at all. You see, this guy was so exhausted and had exercised for so many hours now that some of his normal body functions, his bodily functions, they weren't functioning like they normally do anymore. And so this guy's bowels no longer functioned. He couldn't hold them. And as a result, he had defecated all over himself. Not only that, but he could no longer control his muscle function in his legs. And as the last 100 yards, this guy's legs were just completely buckling on him. And he kept falling down. But instead of quitting, he kept getting back up. And he would fall down again and he'd run a little bit further. And even as he crossed the finish line, he fell to the ground. This guy refused to quit as he stumbled across the line. Can you imagine the pain and exhaustion that he had been feeling for hours to finally be at this point? Can you imagine how difficult his recovery was going to be? But can you also imagine when that guy fell across the line, just how genuinely happy he was because he had finished? He was a finisher. And if ever there was a person, a triathlete who was approved, he didn't win, but he finished. It was this guy. And finishing was the key. Enduring was the key to genuine happiness. You know, trials are hard. You know that. You've lived through them. Some of you are living through them right now. And you know that some trials are harder than others. There are times when you really do wonder, like that guy, can I even put another foot in front of the other? I don't know if I can do it. Sometimes it's, you wake up in the morning and it's like, can I really get through another day? You just want to drop the weight of the world and walk away, stop enduring. But James said that there is a happiness attached to enduring trials that cannot be known any other way. But what about those very darkest moments? You know, if there's hope that the electricity is going to come back on, then maybe I can get through it till it comes on. But what about those darkest moments when it doesn't look like it's ever going to come back on? How can you and I possibly be happy during those kinds of trials? Well, James said, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him." You know, sometimes I get annoyed at people who flippantly talk about the promises of God, and that probably reveals a lot more about me than it does about them. But here is one promise that you and I can absolutely take to the bank. If you love God in the face of trials, you will endure, and that will lead to genuine happiness. God has promised it. Loving God is the key to an attitude that allows you and me to endure when it looks like the electricity isn't going to come back on. Even though James only directly mentioned loving God 2 times in his book, this one here and over in chapter 2, verse 5, the only 2 times he mentions it in the whole book, even though he didn't mention it much, it was still the key to everything he said. So how do you and I love God in the midst of our most difficult trials? Well, I want to suggest that the only way that you and I can do that is if we view trials within the context of life that we talked about last week. You remember that last week we said that life happens in 3 stages. There's stage 1 in the womb, where we are developed for 9 months to live in stage 2, this life on earth. And then there is stage 3, eternity with God. Understanding these 3 stages of life is what gives our lives and the trials we face the context we need. It's what allows you and me to understand and respond with wisdom in our trials. And that's what we talked about last week. If we understand that stage 2, this life right now, is not just about now. In fact, stage 2 is primarily about developing us for eternity in stage 3. If we understand that in the same way that we understand that stage 1 in the womb, those 9 months, is not primarily about stage 1, but it's about developing us for stage 2, then we are able to realize the value of our trials as God uses them to prepare you and me for stage 3. And this context, this perspective, this understanding is what affects our attitude toward them. James knew that with this perspective, this is what allows us to rejoice, as he said in verse 2 in week 1, even when trials hijack our lives. But if our perspective is limited, if we think, as most people do, that stage 2, that right now is only about now, then when the electricity goes off, you can't possibly be happy. Why is that? Well, when the electricity goes off, if you only have a stage 2 perspective, then what you love has been lost. If life is only about now, then what you love is limited to now. If what you love is limited to now, how can you love God who isn't limited to now? Well, you can't. We can't love God in the midst of trials unless we can put the trial in a greater context. Without context and the eternal perspective that it provides, you and I will never love God more than we love the electricity being on. We'll be what James called a double-minded man. And so you'll recall last week that we said that we have to settle this debate in our lives. Are we going to live now as if there is no eternity? Are we going to live stage 2 as if there is no stage 3? Or are we going to live and understand life now as preparation for then? Because until we do that, it will be difficult, if not impossible, for you and me to love and appreciate God when we are going through trials in this life. But let's be honest. What if we don't love God in the midst of our trials when the electricity goes off? What might happen to our attitude then? Well, James raises that question in verses 13 to 16. Look at what he says. He says, "Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one." James knew that apart from a genuine love of God, when our view of trials, we might actually view them as evil, and we might actually blame God for the trials that we're facing. But James said, it's not possible for our trials to be evil because God's nature prevents him from using trials in any evil way. with the use of the word tempt, okay? With the use of the word tempt here, James was making a play on words between verse 12 and verse 13, because the word tempt and the word trial actually come from the same root word. So they share this common root together. The word tempt means to make an attempt to make someone do something wrong. The word test actually means to attempt to learn the nature or character of something. James's point was that a trial can be both a test and a temptation at the very same time. If we love God in the midst of our trials, we understand them to be a test that God is using to find out who we really are, so that when we endure, it results in genuine happiness. Without this perspective, our trials quickly turn into a temptation where we blame God for something evil that is happening to us. James said emphatically, that isn't possible. Such blaming is completely illegitimate, because by God's very nature, he can't be tempted and he doesn't tempt. So when does the trial cease to be a test and become a temptation? James told us. He said, but each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Now, for many of us, when we hear the word desire, we automatically assign a negative connotation to that word, like all desires are bad. But the word actually just means a longing. And in the New Testament, it was used in both positive ways and negative ways. Positively, for example, Paul used it in 1 Thessalonians when he was writing to them, saying, I desired to come back and see you. You remember Paul had been kicked out, and he was concerned about the persecution that was going on in Thessalonica. And Paul had this longing, this desire to go back and see them. He also used the word positively in the book of Philippians. There he told the Philippians, he said, I'm in prison, and my desire is to go on and depart this world and to be with Christ. So that was a positive use of this word. But of course, the word can also refer to a craving or a lust that leads to sin and death. So how is James using it here? Well, it's certainly true that any lust allows us to be lured and enticed into sin that can easily cause premature death in our lives. But I think James had a more nuanced meaning here in this context. James was referring to the desire to get out from under the trial. If you go back to our Mr. Atlas illustration, it's the desire to roll that thing off and walk away to get to where the electricity is on. God always uses trials for our benefit. He uses trials to develop you and me so that we'll be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. When we endure those trials, he awards us with the crown of life, which is the genuine happiness that we desire. However, Satan uses the very same trial to tempt you and me to roll it off and to walk away, to take a shortcut to find a temporary source of happiness, to find any place or anyone where the electricity is on. Every trial is both a test and a temptation. Just think about this. I mean, if you're in a rough spot in your marriage, it's both a test and a trial. That rough spot in your marriage might be what God's going to use to actually change you. He's going to develop you. He's going to show you your part of that conflict in the marriage. He's going to show your spouse their part of the conflict if you endure and stay in it. But it's tough, right? I mean, who wants to get up every day and be in conflict with each other? So the temptation is to do what? Not to stay in and endure. The temptation is to walk away. Find someone else who's easier to get along with. But y'all, when we do that, the trials don't actually change us. We just walk away and find a place where the electricity is on. The same thing can be true. Maybe your child has contracted some kind of a disease. I mean, we don't expect that in children. They become seriously ill. What's the temptation? To blame God. Like, you could do something about this. Why are you letting me go through this? Why is my child suffering that way? The same thing happens when our health fails. Or maybe if you're single and you're wondering, like, am I going to be alone the rest of my life? And so the test is, am I going to wait for that right guy or girl to come along, the kind of person I want to spend my life with? Or am I just going to go find any girl and any guy? Because there's lots of them that'll have you. And so it becomes a temptation to not endure. That can happen whenever a Christian leader disappoints us. It can happen when a loved one dies. It's always the way every trial is. It's a test and a temptation at the same time. But James warned us. In verse 16, he said, "Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers." When James uses this phrase, beloved, that adjective with the word brothers, he only uses it a few times in the book. When he uses it, he's calling special attention to what he's saying. Y'all, don't be deceived. Let's solve this problem. Rolling it off, not enduring, finding the easy way out, finding where the electricity is on again. It will never produce genuine happiness. James knew that how you and I face our trials determines their outcome. It's only when we love God through them that they produce genuine happiness. So if we're struggling to love God when the electricity goes off, and I certainly understand how any of us could be, what can we do? Because we're not pretending that this is easy stuff. This is tough stuff. Trials can easily become temptation. So how do we love God instead of blaming Him? Well, in verses 17 and 18, James answers that question, and I just think it's the coolest thing. James gave us a major reminder of something that we already know. And he called it back to teach us how to love God in trials. He said, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. James made the statement right up front. He said, God is only capable of giving good and perfect gifts. And he said there's a reason. And the reason is that there is no variation or shadow due to change in God. Now, this word change is only used this one time in the whole of the New Testament. And it means a turning. And it usually referred to a revolution of the heavenly bodies. Okay? So the word was associated with the movement of the stars. And what James was doing is he was taking it as a metaphor to show us that unlike how our sun and moon change, right? So, if you may not see it much living in the city, but if you lived at the river where I do, like when the moon starts coming up, anybody know there's a new moon coming up right now? Like when the moon starts coming up every night, it gets brighter and brighter. And over the days, it just gets brighter until it starts to wane, and then it gets darker and darker. And that moonlight changes. There's a shadow in it. But James says God never changes. He's not dark at one point and really bright and then dark again. God is always consistent. He's always the same. Everything He gives is good. He is not capable of giving anything to us that isn't good and perfect. An example of His good and perfect gifts, He told us in verse 18. He said, of His own will He brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of His creatures. Now, the phrase brought us forth translates a word that literally means to give birth. Clearly, James isn't thinking of a physical birth here. He is thinking of our new birth whenever you and I heard the word of truth, the truth about the gospel, about Christ's death and resurrection for us. And whenever we heard that and we believed it and we received it, you and I were birthed again. And James is telling us that this gospel truth that causes you and me to be born again, this is an example of His good and perfect gifts. You remember when that happened to you? Man, I remember when it happened to me. I was 6 years old. We were living in in Akron, Ohio at the time. And for a couple of weeks, I had been going into my room reading the story about the cross and the resurrection. I don't even know what 6-year-old does that. I don't know, but I was doing it. And I loved the story of the cross, right? All the soldiers and, nailing him to the tree and just all that stuff. I loved that. I didn't care much about the resurrection, but I really loved the cross part. I remember on a Sunday morning, my dad was the preacher, and I was sitting on the back row of this little Baptist church, and we always gave an invitation at the end of a service there, and man, it was like something just grabbed me by the chest and was pulling me down to the front. I didn't even know what I was going for. When I got down there, Dad said, "Do you want to trust Christ as your Savior?" And I said, "Yes, that's what I came down here to do." I was responding to the love of God. I didn't understand all the theology of the atonement. I didn't understand any of it. I just knew John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave. And James is reminding us of that. It's critical that we remember that this is what God is like. He doesn't change. All his gifts are good. All his gifts are perfect. He's constant. He's consistent. God loves you and me. And James said, just like he loved you in the gospel, he loves you in the trial. God's love never goes dark when the electricity goes off. Y'all, if you and I get this, it will stop us in our tracks because it will completely alter our attitude toward trials. If you receive the gospel with joy, James is saying, receive the trial with joy. Because the same loving God loves you just the same. I want to show you an example of what loving God in trials looks like. We have a collage that we created of a couple of friends of mine. This is Diane Cole and Chris Wiggum. And both Diane and Chris have experienced the electricity going off in their lives. Both of them lost their mates, their lifelong mates, to very difficult illnesses. Diane's husband, George, died of pancreatic cancer. And I'm just telling you, Diane and George were two of the happiest people that you've ever seen in life as a couple. And they had a wonderful family together, just brilliant. And George's life was hijacked by pancreatic cancer. It came out of nowhere. In fact, they were so surprised by it that when it was discovered, it was already in stage 4. And Diane, loyally and faithfully, she went with George through all the ups and downs of cancer treatment. And they tried some things to try to prolong his life. And Diane went through all of that with him. Not only that, but Diane has been such an honoring wife to George and to his legacy by the way that she has lived her life in the years since George passed away. Chris, his wife, Linda, lived in physical agony for decades. Linda's body produced too much cerebral spinal fluid, and this caused pressure for her, and it actually caused her to start having really horrible migraine headaches, and eventually it actually led to Linda's blindness. She had multiple surgeries over decades to try to solve this. They could never solve it. And through all those decades, Chris remained an incredibly loyal husband and tireless servant, helping Linda in every possible way. Both Diane and Chris endured all the way through the electricity being off in their lives. But there's something even more incredible about Diane and Chris than just the fact that they endured, as impressive as that was. You see, we, their friends, all got to watch this happen to them from a distance. This often happens, right? When you're going through trials, you're watching someone else go through it. We watched Diane and Chris go through it. And what all of us were amazed at was their attitude in it. I mean, we just couldn't believe it. I won't say that they were giggly laughing every day, but these two people, they just had a love for their mates that could have only come from their love for God. And we saw this in their attitude, their willingness, their ability, their strength to endure. And we were so impressed by what we saw. We were just amazed by their attitude. It was exactly the kind of attitude that James is calling for from you and me. So you can imagine how thrilled hundreds of us were, over 500 of us, when we found out this last week on Facebook that Chris and Diane are getting married this next weekend, May 14th. And you can see the genuine happiness exuding from them. And of course, this is partially because they both lived through the long, dark days of the electricity being off, and now it has come back on as they have found one another. Of course, that's part of their happiness. But y'all, for those of us who know Diane and Chris, we know that the joy we are seeing on their faces is rooted in the full experience of what James has been talking to us about in the first 18 verses of his letter. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. Y'all, Diane and Chris know how privileged and fortunate they are to have endured many dark days and to come out on the other side. I promise you they know that. Their trials were brutal, but God was better. And Diane and Chris both knew that, they believed it, they lived it, and it's the key to the happiness that they're experiencing today. And so today, I'm asking you, as you go through trials in your life, as the electricity is off, maybe it's pretty dark and pretty hot, and you're tempted to find another place where it's on, I'm asking you to cling to the God who loves you, and to love him until the electricity comes back on, and to love him if the electricity never comes back on. Of course, when the electricity is on, I love you, Lord. But when it goes off, that's hard. We admit that. And so I want you to imagine what would happen to us if we learn to do this. I can't honestly think of anything more upside down and amazing from what most people think, to love God in the midst of trials, to believe that he loves us as much in the gospel and in the trials at the same time. I know it's an odd thing to ask. But y'all, if you and I live that way, it's going to change our attitude. It's going to change our lives. It's going to help you and me get through trials, come out on the other side, and it's going to have a huge impact on other people around us. And so that's what we're looking for as we work our way through the book of James. I pray that for you.